So DC Comics just did something really interesting. They published a comic featuring Jesus Christ. So I went down to my local comic book shop and I picked up an issue of Swamp Thing 1989 number 1. Welcome to Nazirite Media Real Talk, where I give unscripted, unfiltered deep dives into conversations that we couldn't cover in our main videos. Now, I do read comics from time to time. I'm not like a huge comic book fan. I just recently started getting into collecting single issues like this. I have never read a Swamp Thing comic before. I know the series is kind of like a horror series. He kind of gets into very mystical, mysterious, kind of occult references. At least that's what I've been able to tell from just doing research on Swamp Thing. Like I said, I'm very familiar with Swamp Thing. I know Swamp Thing as a character. He's been a part of DC Universe for a long time, but I've never actually read Swamp Thing. So when I heard that DC was releasing an issue that features Jesus Christ as one of the characters in the story, I was like, I need to check this out. I need to see, is this good? Is it bad? I heard nothing but good things from social media. And so I went and I picked it up as soon as I could. And I wanted to talk about it here today. I want to talk about the good, I want to talk about the bad, and I want to tell you what I think. We're going to go through the story and I'm going to show you what DC did here. It's actually quite shocking. I'm actually really surprised that they did this. In a nutshell, this Swamp Thing issue was actually written in 1988. So this isn't a new story. I believe the writer and artist had started this series, they wrote this issue, and DC rejected it. To my understanding, they had some kind of a policy or some kind of a rule at the time that they couldn't depict Jesus Christ in this way, and so they rejected the comic, and it's been shelved until now. And so that's why this comic just got published, even though it was written all the way back in 1988. Even just on the cover, if you look at the cover of it, we have Swamp Thing, and he's carrying a lamb. Now, obviously, symbolically, Jesus Christ is the sacrificial lamb. Jesus Christ is the Lamb of God. And so when we see Swamp Thing carrying the lamb, and there's like a light shining on him, he's carrying the lamb respectfully. So this cover kind of emphasizes and shows Swamp Thing respecting and caring for Jesus. And I think we see that in the story. As the story progresses and as the story goes along, I think you'll see that Swamp Thing does have this kind of respect and this honor towards Jesus, which I find fascinating. And so I do like the cover of it, at least. Now, in the back of the comic, they show you what the cover was going to be. Now, the original cover for this comic, I can understand why this was kind of considered sacrilegious and maybe blasphemous. And so this did not get published, and I'm glad this didn't get published. But the original cover of Swamp Thing that was proposed all the way back in 1989 actually has Swamp Thing like on the crucifix. And it's just a very strange image. I don't really know what it means. Obviously, in the background of this image, you can see Jesus is on the cross in the background with the two criminals next to him side by side. And so why Swamp Thing is also on a crucifix, I don't really know. But I'm glad that they didn't go with that cover for this release. I think the cover that they went with is just much more respectful. And so I can see why the editors and the publishers at DC probably saw this issue get submitted and they probably just canceled it just based on the cover alone. I don't even know if they read the story. Even if this story does have problems, and even if they didn't treat Jesus the way as Christians we would like them to treat Jesus, I think it's important that we support this kind of art and that we go out to our local comic book shops and we support this kind of thing, because it's crucial that we send a message to companies like Marvel and DC that what we want is, religious storytelling. We want religious themes. We want to tackle the big questions in life. We want less political, less, social commentary, and we want more stories like this. So even if you don't agree with this comic, and I certainly don't agree with this comic, I want to see more stories like this. And I think it's important that we, as Christians, we pressure entertainment companies, even companies like Disney, to release more stories that address themes like this and address topics like this. Before we move on with the rest of the video, I just wanted to give a quick content warning. This comic will show some graphic violence and blood. I'm not going to show the entire comic either, so if you want to read the whole comic yourself, please make sure to pick it up from your local comic book shop. So the story starts out with Swamp Thing, and he's floating through, the multiverse. It starts out, he says, "I'm floating in an intemporal state, awash in an endless stream of possible worlds and alternate realities." So I think he's floating through the multiverse. I don't really know what happened in the story beforehand to get him to this point. He's floating through the multiverse, and you can see there's different realities, there's different worlds passing him by as he goes down. I think it's interesting. He says that he feels like he's being compelled by a force. So he's not just like aimlessly floating. He's floating towards something. He's floating in one direction. He says, could it be some force that tells me to reorient myself? Now that's like God. I mean, I don't know exactly what's happening here, but for whatever reason, Swamp Thing is getting pulled back in time. He's getting pulled back to 2,000 years ago when Jesus Christ was crucified. So it's really fascinating to me that he describes it like it's a force that tells him to reorient himself. That's like God. For us as Christians, we feel this force compelling us to reorient ourselves, and that's the Holy Spirit. And he says, why then do I hesitate? So that I may witness celestial events of an earlier era. So that's fascinating because right here he's confirming that like the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is a celestial event. It's not like one thing that happened way back in history. It's something that impacts the whole cosmos. And so the writer is confirming that, which is really awesome. Like even in the DC Comics universe, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is considered a celestial event that impacted the whole cosmos. That's awesome. And he says it's a much more perfect nature. And so I feel like he's acknowledging, like he's getting drawn towards this earlier time in the past because Jesus Christ was perfect. So right off the bat, we're off to a good start. I think it's really cool. He says, as helpless as a spawning salmon, I began to swim upstream. As you see at the very center of this whole multiverse thing that he's swimming in, he sees like a cross shape. I don't know if this is a direct reference to Jesus Christ and the cross that he died on, or if this is just like the single point in the multiverse. But for some reason, like it's like the central thing that he's like floating towards, and I think that's kind of cool. As the story progresses, you'll see where things kind of fall apart. As you see, even on this page, the title of this comic is "The Morning of the Magician," and so the way that they treat Jesus in the story is a little sketch. Right at the beginning, it says, "And so it came to pass from the house of David there arose a great magician." As we go along in the story, you'll see that they continuously refer to Jesus as a magician. Obviously, as Christians, we never call Jesus a magician. You really never hear anybody say, oh, Jesus was a magician, he was a magician. And the reason why is because we often associate magicians with either doing fake magic or doing real magic that is associated with like occultism, like using evil spirits to do magic or some kind of, witchcraft or some kind of thing like that. At the end of the day, he did miracles. He was a miracle worker. What really separates a miracle from magic is debatable. I would say that what Jesus did isn't magic because he's God. And so I think that when God does things in the world, or when God uses his power to change things in the world, it's indistinguishable from magic. It looks just like magic, but it's actually a miracle. And so that to me is the difference. I think magic, and I talked about this a little bit in our Doctor Strange video, and I talked about it again, I think in our Aladdin video. So magic is usually like an attempt by a person to manipulate the universe. It's an attempt by a mortal being to manipulate and change the universe. And so they'll use evil spirits to do that, or they think that they have like the power within themselves to do that. To me, I don't think that what Jesus does is magic because Jesus was God. And so it's really God impacting the universe and manipulating the universe. And that's just what God does. And so that's more of a miracle, right? C.S. Lewis, I think, talks about this in his book on miracles. But we have to be able to acknowledge that from everybody else's perspective, Jesus was a magician, right? If you're not a Christian and you don't believe in the Bible and you don't believe that Jesus was God, then to you, if you saw this guy performing miracles, you would think that he was some kind of a magician. I think that might be the perspective this author's taking, because I don't know if this author is a Christian themselves. And they're obviously writing from the perspective of a character who is probably not a Christian, right? Swamp Thing, I think, is the one narrating the story right now, and I don't think he's a Christian. And so I think he's calling Jesus a magician because he doesn't know any better. But regardless, they correctly identify him as coming from the house of David. And so this looks like Jesus at the Last Supper, and this is a fairly accurate and respectful representation of Jesus at the Last Supper. He says, "Behold," and then Swamp Thing goes on to say he was a worker of miracles surrounded by a loyal band of followers. That's accurate. Some called him the first alchemist, and so that's where obviously we wouldn't call him an alchemist. My understanding of alchemy is that it's the idea that you can change one form of matter into like another form of matter. And so somebody looking at Jesus turning water into wine or something like that, they would say, oh, it's alchemy, right? And so if somebody saw that from the outside, I could understand why they would think that's alchemy, but we wouldn't call him that. So he says some called him the first alchemist and some the Messiah. Obviously, we'd call him the Messiah. And to others, he was the Son of God. Obviously, we would consider him the Son of God. And this is Jesus saying, this is my body and this is my blood. And so I think that's a fairly respectful representation of that Last Supper. But then things get a little weird. Throughout the rest of the story, you'll see the author takes a lot of liberties with the biblical account, and he adds a lot of random details here and there that obviously aren't part of the biblical stories. These three magician guys, and they're like sacrificing things to a demon. And so it says, but to the dark hidden forces that held the soul of man in a hideous trenchant grip since the fall of Adam, he was the enemy. Now, this I'd agree with. I actually do think that a lot of the people who saw Jesus as the enemy were actually demonically inspired. I think that there's plenty of evidence that many of the Jews even who killed Jesus were probably demonically inspired. Just before St. Stephen was stoned to death in the book of Acts, Stephen criticizes the Jews for being in league with ancient pagan gods. I believe he calls them worshippers of Moloch and worshippers of Remphan. And so without a doubt, there was some evil, demonic practices that I think the Jews were engaged in. And otherwise, I don't think they would have killed Jesus to begin with. And otherwise, I don't think Stephen would have criticized them for being involved in such practices. And so there is a tinge of truth here that Jesus was the enemy to those who effectively worshipped demons. I don't think it was as explicit and as, obvious as they are here. These guys literally, it looks like this guy has a heart in his hand and he's squeezing it and says, Lord of the Flies, accept our sacrifice. So they're directly sacrificing things to a demon. He says, O Prince of Pandemonium, devourer of light, hear our summons. O Spirit of licentiousness, O fallen virtue, grace us with your presence. O King of the Anakic demons, join us. And so they're calling upon a demon pretty explicitly. I don't really know if anybody or anyone really does things like that, that explicitly. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe this is what Epstein was doing on the island the whole time. Obviously, we know that there's been tons of evidence that has come out that he was involved in a lot of weird, creepy, pagan, occult rituals, but maybe he's summoning demons out there. Who knows? And so the demon says, Foolish Magi, did your book of spells fail to mention that he who looks on the face of Belial views only death? And so now we have the name of this demon. The name of this demon is Belial. But regardless, they're obviously talking to a demon, and they're trying to sacrifice to a demon. And he says, Excellent, then we understand each other. Now speak, why do you summon Belial to this miserable excuse for a planet? That's kind of a weird line because obviously the demons live on this planet. From a Christian perspective, it's not like they live somewhere else and they get summoned to Earth. I think in a lot of comic books and entertainment, there's this idea that demons are in hell and they have to come here. But in reality, the demons are already here. They're not in hell, waiting to come over or waiting to be summoned. They're already here. They're all around us. And so, yeah, this is that's kind of a misunderstanding, I would say. Okay, and then they say, there is a man, O Lord, a carpenter from Nazareth. He has mastered the conjurer's art already. He holds the keys of Solomon and many other power objects. In the name of love, he heals the sick and raises the dead. All right, obviously I would take issue with this. Obviously these guys are bad guys, and so you can't really hold tightly to what they say. You got to take it with a grain of salt. And so he says that there's a man, O Lord, a carpenter from Nazareth. Jesus was a man, but he was also God. Clearly these guys don't believe that. And then the other guy says that he's mastered the conjurer's art, as if it was a kind of magic or a kind of sorcery that Jesus has learned and mastered. That's not accurate. Jesus is God, so he just had that power naturally. But from the perspective of the enemy, I guess they're looking at him and thinking of him like he's some kind of a sorcerer. But then he says he holds the keys of Solomon and many other power objects. That's false. There's no evidence Jesus held, quote, the keys of Solomon. In fact, we don't even really know if the keys of Solomon are real. That's kind of, my understanding of the keys of Solomon are that's kind of a later addition. That's kind of one of those things that they made up in the Middle Ages for occultism about Solomon having the keys to control demons or something like that. Jesus had the power to control demons because he was God. So when Jesus casts demons out or when he does exorcisms and these things, he commands them. It's because he's God. It's not because he holds the keys of Solomon. But this guy here might just be misunderstanding because he is a bad guy. So I don't know. But then the other guy says, in the name of love, he heals the sick and raises the dead. And yeah, that's accurate. Jesus in love was able to heal the sick and raise the dead. And so that is true. It's funny that he's taking issue with somebody doing that. And so the demon says, Belial, he goes, the Nazarene, yes, I've heard of this young usurper. They say he resisted the temptations of Lucifer himself. And yeah, that is true. Jesus in the desert resisted the temptations of Satan. And then the guys say, in the guise of wise men, we witnessed his humble virgin birth. And so now this is where obviously the author is taking liberties. He's saying that these magician guys who came to witness Jesus' birth, when you read the story and it says that the wise men or the magi came and they gave gifts to Jesus, he's saying that these are the same guys, these three guys, and that now they're evil, They worship demons, but back then they came and they witnessed the birth of Christ and they gave the gifts. Obviously, there's no evidence for this. There's no biblical account of this. This is just conjecture, and it's just like a made-up story for this comic book. If only we had understood his power, we would have killed him then. Now he threatens to wake humanity from its age-old slumber. And so you have to realize that like there couldn't even possibly be any truth to that, because they knew his power even back then. The Bible says that these magi came because they saw the North Star. My best interpretation of that I'd have to give is that these guys probably were, some kind of astrologers. They probably were maybe from the East. Whether they were Zoroastrian or Persians or whatever. I've heard different stories of that, or whether they were Egyptians, I don't really know. But the point is that these guys were like looking to the stars. They were looking at the constellations. They were astrologers trying to find meaning and a certain meaning by looking at the stars. And when they saw that North Star shining brightly, they knew something was going on over there. Of course, it was angelic activity. It was the angels signaling the birth of the Messiah. But they knew something important was happening, and when they came, they gave gifts to Jesus, and the gifts signify that he was a king and that he would be the Messiah and that he would later die one day. I believe they gave him gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And these are gifts that you would only give to a king, and I think even frankincense and myrrh are used for burial rituals. And so regardless, these guys definitely knew that he had power and that this was an important baby, right? And so for them to say like, oh, if we had only known back then, we would have killed him. Yeah, no, you wouldn't have. They knew back then, right? And so this is why this story is kind of taking, too many liberties now, I think, for my liking. Then you shall kill this Nazarene master. Demons do not slay, foolish one. We corrupt, we defile, we desecrate, and our instrument is man's own sordid nature. Now that I agree with. I don't think that the demons really can kill or really can do anything. I don't even think Satan really has the power to create anything or really do much other than just corrupt and invert what God has already done and created. And so now this is the rest of the story is like this whole made up story about this like Roman centurion named Marcus, and he's in a relationship with Mary Magdalene. Now I don't really know that there's any actual biblical evidence that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. I don't know why, but for some reason I've heard this in countless stories, and I've heard people talk about her a lot as like a prostitute, but I haven't seen any evidence of that myself. I just know it's like one of those common things that you hear in pop culture all the time. Oh, Mary Magdalene was a prostitute. Regardless, this author is taking the position that, Mary was a prostitute, and in this story she has like a relationship with this Roman guard. His name is Marcus. He's like a Roman centurion, and so he has to go and leave her behind so that he can go back to work. And Mary Magdalene knows that something bad is about to happen. She says, "It concerns a young man, a carpenter from Nazareth. Some call him a prophet, and he has spoken out loudly against the exploitation of our people." Now there's talk that Pontius Pilate is displeased. My understanding was that Pontius Pilate and Herod both had very little interest in actually killing Jesus. They had to be convinced by the Jews. Like if you read the biblical story, they get approached, I think at least a couple times, asking for Jesus to be killed, and they kind of take the perspective of, we don't really see what he's doing wrong. Like we don't really know what he's doing. That's a problem for you guys. It's the Jews who insist over and over again that he is murdered. And so eventually they make a deal, and Rome does obviously crucify Jesus, but I don't think they really do it because they see him as a threat or because he was like a major political problem for them. Obviously Rome is guilty for killing Jesus, but I think they were pressured into it more than anything. So the guy says, "I've heard of this Nazarene or his good works with the poor and sick and the many who would like to see him nailed to a cross." That's accurate, but I'll be the one they'll send to arrest him, and it will be a simple matter to let him slip away. So this guy is saying that like he's going to like free Jesus, which is pretty cool. I think he knows Jesus is innocent and he doesn't actually want to see Jesus crucified, so he's willing to let him go, which is pretty cool. So then he takes off, and then he gets embodied by a demon. Like that Belial demon comes and like possesses him. And so you can kind of see where this is going. Like the author is kind of implying that it was like this demon-possessed Roman guard who went and crucified Jesus on the cross. But obviously that isn't biblical. Like there's no biblical evidence of that kind of thing happening. So Swamp Thing is still floating through space. So he's just flying through the multiverse still. And he says the desire to meet the sculptor of this subtle mediation is strong. Is that him saying that he wants to meet God? The one who sculpted the multiverse? I don't know. I do not yet understand the mechanism by which this object keeps casting me adrift, but it cannot be mere serendipity that it is always there to do so. As I close my eyes and dive into the current, it is with an intuitive certainty that the amber will be waiting for me wherever I emerge. So it sounds like he's just like floating by faith, trusting in faith that he's going to go wherever he needs to be led to. And so then he's taken through these different eras of time. He says, and then I'm tasting the rich, dark kiss of Central American soil where Mayan masters of astronomy who worship time have built a thriving civilization. So now he's in ancient Maya, which is kind of cool. Then he's in like ancient Europe, which is kind of cool. He says, in northern Europe, I find Celtic nomads whose druid priests assure them of the divinity of the forest itself. Tempted to accept their heartfelt worship, I keep moving. And he says, heading east into India, where devotees of Krishna compose the Bhagavad Gita, while Buddhists contemplate the uselessness of words to describe the absolute. Checking a desire to join the debate, I continue. To the Mediterranean, where a mighty empire forged by the will of Julius Caesar has given way to the corruption of Tiberius, remembering that it shall soon be followed by the madness of Caligula, I do not tarry. So now this is where like it's kind of interesting here, where like he's saying that like he's flying through time, but he's not like compelled or fascinated by these civilizations or their religious practices. He goes to ancient Maya and sees the temples, but he's like, nah, I'm gonna keep moving. He goes to northern Europe and he sees the druids in the forest and he says, nah, I'm gonna keep moving. And he sees the Hindus and the Buddhists in India and he says, nah, I'm gonna keep moving. And so it's kind of interesting that like he's not like compelled to stay by any force other than Jesus. And you'll see that in a minute here. He says, my final stop is a rocky plateau on the southeast rim of the Mediterranean basin, homeland of 1,000 years to a people who call themselves chosen, obviously referring to the Jews, like being the chosen people of God. In a well-kept garden at the foot of a mountain lined with olive trees, I discreetly observed the tableau unfolding below me. Through the human memories that were my birthright, it is a scene that is known to me. So to my understanding, Swamp Thing is like a monster, but he still has like human memories because he might have once been a man or something like that at one point. And so he's saying that he recognizes this scene as Jesus of Nazareth because he says Alec Holland revered this man not only as an important figure in the history of humanity, but as a deity. So Alec Holland, I believe, is the real identity of the man Swamp Thing, or the man that Swamp Thing used to be before he became a monster. At least that's my understanding of it. And so he's saying that he remembers that Alec Holland, this man, basically worshipped Jesus Christ as God. And so he's captivated and fascinated by Jesus because he knows that Jesus is a deity. You know, he knows that Jesus isn't just a man. He was a revered man and he was God. And so Swamp Thing stops time traveling and he stops to watch this scene from afar. The doctrines of great religions credit him with redeeming the souls of all who live. That's accurate. But as one who has walked through the teeming afterlife, I must question if any single being can work such a supreme act of magic. So now it sounds like Swamp Thing is approaching Jesus with skepticism. Maybe that's why he's compelled to stay and watch, because he just can't believe that Jesus could possibly redeem the souls of all who lived. And so he calls it magic, kind of like the other guys were saying, this was a magician, this guy does magic. And so he's just shocked and surprised that Jesus could even do this. And so he stops and is watching. He says he's more aware than other humans. So yeah, Jesus begins to close his eyes and to meditate, and it's almost as if he is certain that all is in perfect order. Now this is a little mixed for me. I kind of have a mixed reaction to this, because in one sense, Jesus was following the will of his Father, and he did it perfectly, and he knew that there was a grand plan. And so I understand the sense to say that, Jesus would have been calm and peaceful at all times, and he would have just been, completely going with the way of the things are supposed to be. And so I get that understanding, and I get why this was depicted, but they're supposed to be in the Garden of Gethsemane right now, I think. And I mean, if you read that story of the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is like sweating blood. He's so stressed out about what's about to happen and the pain he's about to endure that he's like already sweating blood. So just because Jesus voluntarily sacrificed himself and he went fully along with God's plan, or his plan, right? The fact of the matter is Jesus did have a human nature, and that human nature did suffer, right? That human nature did stress. And so we see Jesus in the garden, in the story of the Garden of Gethsemane, he's sweating blood because he's so stressed about what's about to happen. And assuming that's where the characters are now in this story, and Swamp Thing is watching from the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus shouldn't just be quietly meditating at peace. He should be sweating blood. Back to the garden, Swamp Thing says, recognizing one of the objects at his feet, I decided to approach the meditator. 6 centuries from now, this simple cup shall be revered as the Holy Grail and contain the seeds of the fall of Camelot. Then it will hold the mysterious bit of amber that wields such power over me. Here and now it is empty, perhaps for a reason. If this man is who I think he is, then he faces a grisly future indeed. I offer a drink of purest fruit nectar to soothe his contemplations. So this is really weird, because I thought the legend of the Holy Grail was that this is the cup that contained the blood of Jesus. I don't remember if it was the blood that falls into the cup from bleeding sweat in the garden, or if it was the blood that came from his crucifixion and the cup caught that blood. I can't recall, because I don't remember the Holy Grail ever actually being in the Bible. I thought this is just one of those Arthurian legends. But what's strange is that Swamp Thing offers him basically juice from the vine of his fruit to drink. Really weird. I don't know what is trying to be said here. on one side, I kind of like that Swamp Thing. Again, he has this respect for Jesus. He has this deep admiration for him. He's like mesmerized watching Jesus, and he's offering this juice to drink as like a gift to him, and that's kind of cool. But on the other hand, is the author saying that like Jesus never actually bled? Is he saying that the Holy Grail never really contained Jesus's blood? It was actually Swamp Thing's juice? Because that's really weird. I don't really know the point of this page here. So anyways, the demon possessed guy, Marcus, he's going to look for Jesus. They say we've got an informer, Marcus. Judas Iscariot will lead us to him. Once again, biblically accurate. Judas does give up Jesus and does lead the Roman guards to him. The part of Judas betraying Jesus is biblically accurate, but this is obviously this whole like demon captain guy is definitely fake. So let's see, back to Swamp Thing. He says, I hear the blustering cries of domineering men at arms in lockstep. They're coming for him. So Swamp Thing knows that people are coming after Jesus. Those charged with protecting him dream the sleep of denial. He's talking about the disciples who were sleeping in the garden, and they don't see that Jesus is about to get captured and attacked in the middle of the night. I have battled enough evil magicians to know that sorcery requires sacrifice to give it permanence. That's an interesting line right there. Because in every religion across the world, every religion requires sacrifice. I mean, the whole world and all of reality functions based on sacrifice. You can't get something for nothing. When you go to the store to pick up anything, you have to sacrifice your money in order to get something in return. You have to sacrifice time in order to get that money, right? So there's nothing in this world that doesn't function without sacrifice. And like magic, sorcery, witchcraft, and even Christianity all function in that same way too, where it's like, he says here that he knows that sorcery requires sacrifice to give it permanence. And you see that, like anybody who conducts any kind of religious ritual or witchcraft or anything, they always have to like sacrifice something or give something up. And sometimes when you hear sacrifice, you think, oh, maybe I have to like kill a squirrel or kill a rabbit or a lamb or something like that to make it work. But that's not like all sacrifice is, right? You could sacrifice your time, you can sacrifice your money. And so this is a very interesting line here, the acknowledgement that everything requires sacrifice. He says, yet this adept casts his spell not for personal gain or temporal power, but from the very heart of compassion. And so he's misreading Jesus. Jesus isn't casting a spell, but Swamp Thing recognizes that there is something deeply powerful about what Jesus is doing because it comes from a place of love and compassion, right? He's not doing evil magic. I can conceive of no violence this man would ever work on any other living being. No innocent blood this man could shed. He can tell just by watching him that like Jesus is perfectly innocent. Jesus is perfectly good. There's nothing wrong with him. It's actually kind of beautiful that he's respecting Jesus in this way, knowing that Jesus isn't doing any of this for, like he says, personal gain or temporal power. He's doing it to help people. It's a sacrifice made for everybody else. So the demon Marcus guy shows up and captures the disciples. What's cool is this is where the action gets really fun because the Swamp Thing wants to defend and protect Jesus. So he comes out, he like bursts out from the ground. He's going to beat up these guys. Swamp Thing seems to know that it's a demon, right? He knows that there's a demon coming after Jesus, and he feels inclined to protect Jesus at all costs. And so Swamp Thing gets up and wants to beat up the bad guys. The disciples are attacking the Roman centurions, and you see this is when Peter actually goes and cuts the ear off of the Roman guard. That actually happened in the Bible. There's actually a story where when this event goes down, Peter does cut off the ear of a Roman centurion, and Jesus takes the ear and puts it back on. He heals the Roman centurion's ear and tells the guys to put away their swords. And so that part is accurate. Peter did do that. Obviously, it wasn't a demon man or a man possessed by a demon, as far as we know. But that has been added. And there was nothing in the Bible that talked about Swamp Thing coming out and beating anybody up. But interesting that that's what happens here. He says, I care not from which vessel raised you from whatever pit you were spawned in. I'll never let your demon tongue sup from this man's good works. He's like defending Jesus. Weirdly, Jesus takes a drink from the cup, which means that he's drinking from Swamp Thing's juice that was given earlier, and that's kind of strange. I don't know what that means or why that happens. Then Swamp Thing says, suddenly the focal point of my violence begins to diminish. My self-righteousness drops away like so much moldy seaweed, and my anger dissolves into a quivering pattern of supernatural spontaneity. He doesn't even know why, but all of a sudden now he's disappearing from time. It's like he wasn't supposed to be there. He's not part of God's plan. He responded in the wrong way with violence and rage, and so now he's like disappearing out of time, and he doesn't really know why. We see Jesus taking the ear, he turns it back into a human ear, and then he puts it back on the guy's head. Once again, that is a real story that did happen, but it wasn't on a demon-possessed man like this. Just very strange. This is just very weird. And so it came to pass, the magician was brought before the Roman justice of Pontius Pilate. Once again, Jesus was not really a magician. Other people thought he was, but he was more than that. But in his own defense, remained as silent as a lamb before its slaughterer. Judged guilty of blasphemy, condemned to crucifixion, he was taken to the common hall and put to the lash, yet he did not cry out or beg for mercy. And when the soldiers dressed him in scarlet and crowned him with thorns, proclaimed him King of the Jews, he did not attend to their indignities. As he dragged the wooden cross on which he was to die through the jeering congregation, he voiced no complaint. It was only as the nails were sunk through his wrists and ankles that he was heard to whisper, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." So far, this whole page is very respectful. This is a very respectful and good representation of what happened. And the next page is one of the best depictions in any comic book series I think you'll find of Jesus being crucified. He says, "This is my body and this is my blood." I have no complaints with these two pages. This is a very respectful depiction of Jesus' crucifixion. But then we go back to that Marcus character, the one that was made up, and he says, "This is my fault, Magdalene. Don't say that, Marcus. You were possessed by a demon. You couldn't help him." And so now the Marcus guy feels really bad because of what he did. And so he acknowledges, he's able to see, like, no, I messed up. This actually is the Son of God. He literally says, "For truly, Magdalene, this man was the Son of God." So it's like he knows he made a mistake. And then we see like that Holy Grail catches the blood of Jesus. And so once again, I thought it was kind of weird earlier when Swamp Thing wanted to put like juice in there for some reason. I didn't understand that. But it looks like the blood is caught. I don't know if that's biblically accurate, but that's what happens. And basically the story almost ends. Like Swamp Thing is back floating through the multiverse again. And he says it ends in the intemporal state just as it began. Only this time it was not the mysterious bit of amber that sent me here. It was him. So he's saying that what drew him was Jesus. It's like he was compelled to go back in time. Jesus is the one who called him there, which is interesting. It was him. When he drank my offering, he consumed me and I became part of his magnificent design. No, too far, man. That's way too far. Like, what does that mean? That Jesus drank part of Swamp Thing and then like Swamp Thing became part of Jesus or Jesus became part of Swamp Thing? Yeah, no, that's weird. That's like, yeah. I don't know what that, like, what are you trying to say there? You know, that's really strange. That's not how communion works, by the way. You know, we commune by eating the body and blood of Jesus. And when we do that, Jesus is with us in a very real way. And we are united to Christ in a very real way. But it's not like Jesus is consuming our body or blood. I don't really know why that happens in this story or what the author is trying to say when he did that. Swamp Thing goes on. He says, "It is a cosmic spell cast in the sublime spirit of love." Now that's fair. What Jesus did is fully done out of the spirit of love. It's not like a spell, but it does have cosmic effects, and it was done out of the spirit of love. And it was sealed in the blood of the most perfect sacrifice of all. And then once again, that's fair, right? Once again, it was the most perfect sacrifice of all. I'm not going to complain about any of that. And so that's pretty much the whole story. I recommend you guys go pick up a copy for yourselves and read it yourselves. Let me know what you think. Did you think it was way too blasphemous and way too evil? Did you think that they really twisted the story and they really took too much liberty? Or do you think that there were some fair, authentic, genuine representations in this story? Once again, I think we need to support more of this kind of work, even if we disagree with it as Christians. It's so much better that we tackle these conversations and we tackle these stories in comic books, movies, music, video games, and TV shows. I think it's way better that we talk about these things and we have these kinds of stories rather than social or political kind of stories. So instead of going and getting, the copy of Spider-Man or a copy of X-Men, maybe consider picking up a copy of Swamp Thing. I think we want to let these companies know that we're interested in these kinds of stories, even if we don't agree. And we should at least spark a conversation on social media. Let me know in the comments what you think about this story. Did you think it went too far? And of course, like always, please let me know in the comments what you think we should cover next. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.